computer. What we do, and Jim, once this is done, we'll make sure that this is sent over to you. It gets edited by a nice lady in the Philippines, and then it comes back to me. And I'm behind on it because I've got I saw the Joyce Carol Oates one. I've got 4 of them I got to do. Oh, one thing we're trying to do right now too is our friend Jack Devine, who is the former head of global intelligence for the CIA, counterintelligence CIA, also the interim director. Let's see if we can kind of quickly get him on a call. That would be fun, considering the news.
Yeah, Jack Devine.
Jack Devine, I got a note, but he's probably swamped beyond it can be, considering that strange things have been going on.
See Jeff.
Good Lord, here's Jeff Joseph. There he is. So I'll wait a few minutes. So what else? And Carl Bernstein has agreed to do a luncheon on his memoir. So, and then I think we can get very, we're gonna do much more film stuff too, because that's back in the day, back in before cars and horse and buggy and cliff spread, when it was only taking place in San Francisco. There was people like Jeff, Joseph, my sister Karen said, you got to come down to San Francisco. You got to come down to Los Angeles if you want to do more stuff about movies.
Mm.
And I remember Jeff came up for the crazy Christopher Hitchens gatherings.
That was my first one.
Really? Now, did you go out? Did you go
No.
out to, because Mallory was there and we all went out and got just completely shit-faced.
No, I ran to catch a plane, fly right back, actually.
And that was an amazing story because we were there and we are all progressively getting drunk. At that point, my wife, who came with me for the luncheon, was disgusted and went home. And she's probably wandering around here somewhere. And then we all went to Clown Alley and we just got plowed. And the more he drank, the more lucid he became. And and his wife was there and he was standing on a table reciting Shakespeare, and we're saying, how the fuck is he doing this? Well, where we can barely connect a word or two together. And so it just.
So you got drunk with Christopher Hitchens?
Yes, we did.
Oh, I'm so envious.
Yeah.
God.
I'll tell you a worse story, Bob. My husband was a bohemian, and he with Mr. Hitchens, who had a little trouble finding his way back to his camp in the dark.
Oh dear. But it was a funny thing. I knew his father-in-law, this Edwin, and he runs a what does he run? He runs a financial firm. And so they're out there, and I've lost touch with Carol. I have an old email. I should write my note to myself, reach out to Edwin for a daughter. And we see Edwin from time to time. But more people have said they've been to the Hitchens luncheon. And if those who said they were actually there, we would have been a situation where the fire marshal would have been called.
I miss Hitch.
Well, it was just crazy.
Yeah, I met him at some event, and he was wearing rumpled clothing, the suit that he wore the night before on Bill Maher. He hadn't gone home, I don't think. Oh, well.
But the thing of it is, though, and what makes it fun is that they tended to come back. And we had him scheduled for New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Then he got sick, and then we had to cancel everything. And then his situation and his health became more precarious, and that was that. But the nice thing about this is that we can do this online. Now, the question is, will we have stuff where we're going to start having, I'm watching the downslope of COVID cases, and that's a good thing. So what we're going to do, we're going to have some gatherings in Los Angeles, probably at Napa Valley Grill, just kind of catch up and reconnect. And we'll have something back at New York. We'll have it at I'm thinking the Capitol Grill, although, in San Francisco, maybe one market, just to kind of hang out and see people again. And
should I have a drink in my hand when I'm doing it?
You know what? I'm not gonna stop you. We'll wait a few
It might be
minutes.
more interesting with one, but
Let me make sure there's some people who are trying to get on here. Hold on, see what we got here. Oh, oops, here we go. Hold on a second. I'm gonna send one off to, all right, hold on, David, it's coming. A few more people here.
You know,
David?
somebody could write a book about Christopher Hitchens stories. I mean, I have like 12 stories about him, and I barely knew the man.
Yeah.
I mean, I met him at the 2000 Republican convention, and he remembered me. And then
Wow.
I met him a few other times, and I just can't believe I was in a meeting with him, and we were with a really large multinational, and he was at the meeting, and he was completely unfiltered. He would say anything, and they
Uh-huh.
thought he was joking, and
Yeah.
he wasn't just. It's like corporate people, when they would see him on TV, when they would see him in a corporate setting, they didn't believe he would be the same as on TV.
Oh,
And he was.
and he was more fun. And the funny story that we had, that was the only time he said, look, I'm not going to charge you anything, but what I want to have is this. I want to make sure that you pay for my drinks. And I like Macallan 18. Okay, that's the good stuff. That's the sipping whiskey. So somehow there was a misunderstanding, and the entire table was doing shots of Macallan 18. The barbell was gruesome, but it was well worth the story. But that's
Wow.
and also and the other thing too, that which is right now, a lot of authors are not getting out there because of COVID.
Mm.
A lot of and so we have found ourselves as almost, are we influencers? I don't know. I think a good case can be we are, and now that I've got a year and a half worth of Luncheon Society videos, we're just gonna run with it. So let's just jump into this right now. Okay.
I can't find the chat that's down the side.
It's at the bottom. Just put chat in, and so before we begin, this is gonna be a lot of fun today. We got a bunch of stuff coming up soon. We have the Dean Ornish will do something on nutrition coming up on the 11th. Then after that, we're going to have the annual Academy Award Luncheon Society, which while he was alive, Richard Schickel used to do that with us in Los Angeles. And this year we're going to have Leonard Moulton do it. We're going to revive the Academy Award Luncheon Societies. So I almost think we should have, Vanity Fair may have the great after party, but I'm going to make the argument perhaps we should have the pre-party. We should have a glass of champagne and some sort of goodie bag. So, well, welcome to the Luncheon Society today with James Curtis. The biography is his biography on Buster Keaton, A Filmmaker's Life. For those who haven't been here before, what the Luncheon Society is a series, well, before the pandemic, was a series of lunches and dinners and private gatherings in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Boston. Since the pandemic, we've gone online. We feel very comfortable online, but what we are going to be scheduling soon will be some gatherings in San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, and all places where we tend to be. So we're looking at that. We should have it soon. That'll be very cool. It's good to see some old friends we haven't seen in a while. And again, I think what's exciting is that right now there's a new appreciation for Buster Keaton and his contributions to cinema. There are 2 books out. We think we got the best of the 2 of them here today with James. So we're excited about that. And what's fun is what strikes me about the book is that at the end of the day, talent wins. And when you look at what Keaton was able to bring to the silent era, he was one of the few people to actually transmit it into the era of the talkies, and had a career that went as far and literally into the William Asher movies into the 60s. And to his credit, even though he went through some difficult times, he still remained true to his art. And I think you see that throughout throughout his book, and I think you see that throughout Buster's life as well. So with that, we'll kick it off to James Curtis. We'll tee up the book for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll dive into Q&As after that. James, you're up.
Oh, thank you, Bob. Actually, what you say is true about Buster Keaton. He was working up until 2 months before he died at the age of 70. So he was a powerful guy in terms of stamina, physical and otherwise, as he demonstrated in many of his films. I think also the thing that distinguished him, to me at least, is the realization of how much he did behind the camera. When I first discovered him, I didn't understand any of that, of course, and hence the title Buster Keaton, A Filmmaker's Life. I want to put more emphasis in this book on what he did behind the camera, in effect, and the amount of control he exerted on his great films, how he brought them about, and really the breadth and scope of his involvement in the entertainment profession, going back to being born in a medicine show in 1895. From that, he progressed on to vaudeville in a big way, and from there to silent pictures in 1917, talkies in 1930, and television in 1949. So he pretty much spanned all modern entertainment media going up to, well, practically the present day. He never streamed, but other than that, he was involved in a little bit of everything. And so it's a story that has a lot of background to it in terms of the various developments over the decades, and how he formed a prominent place in the middle of those things. Sometimes after a while, sometimes initially, and then not later. But he was, I think, a brilliant, instinctively gifted man in terms of rendering what he did on screen. People think of him as the great stone face, the pork pie hat and the string tie, and a guy who cut a distinctive figure in front of the camera. And so I wanted to shine a big spotlight on what he did behind, and that goes to also writing, conceiving, having his own studio, and really doing the same thing essentially that his peers did, meaning Charlie Chaplin and Harold Lloyd back in the 20s especially. And I think his body of work is second to none. And I think that his skill as a filmmaker is self-evident in that respect, but also in terms of how he put across on camera a very distinctive look that is unlike anybody else's. And to this day, 50 years, more than half a century after his death, I think he's probably more popular than ever. And so it's a rather unique story, and one that I was glad I was able to do to the length that it deserved. So with that, do we go to
yeah, we'll just go to something. Why, I mean, my question is, when you look back, and maybe Jeff can actually chime in on a little bit of this too, because of his involvement in the genre. We look back at Chaplin, you look back at Keaton. Why was it that those who were involved in comedy and or slapstick were in fact able to translate their talents in front of the screen, behind the screen? What made them different?
Well, I think a sense of self, for one thing. All these guys started on the stage initially, and so they had to develop personas that doesn't necessarily depend upon technology. Once they brought those to film or in front to the camera medium, it became a question of how do you adapt what you've developed and made successful on stage to what goes on screen. And when you see the early Buster Keaton appearances on screen, meaning the Fatty Arbuckle comedies that he started to do in New York in 1917, you can see some of his stage business. He's bringing that because he really is still getting used to being photographed the way he was. After about 3 films, you see that stuff go away pretty much, and what remains is his gradual and developing understanding of how the film medium works. And by the time Arbuckle and Company pulled up stakes in New York and came out to California, not far from where we are now, where I am anyway, which is Long Beach, he was essentially more sophisticated than most directors in terms of what he understood about the camera, what you could do with the camera. He knew, for instance, that, well, if you look at Arbuckle's work, for instance, and I'll use him as an example because he was a very popular comic in his day, very commercially successful. And Arbuckle did a lot of things, if you look at his films, that he could easily do on stage. He could do things like juggle butcher knives and the like, and he would do that in a kitchen scene, for instance. Well, you can do that on stage just as well. Buster would take whole trains and construct gags around them. You know, he understood that you could take the camera and take it places that you couldn't show on stage. And so he had an idea of how to use that capability to make funny films. And I think that was probably the real difference between Buster and everyone else, is that he had such a gift, and it wasn't taught to him. He picked it up, but he also, I think, had the mind of a civil engineer, you could say. I knew an assistant director who worked on 2 films with Chaplin. His name was Eddie Sutherland. He became a director himself later. And he said Chaplin didn't know the difference between a 1-inch lens and a 2-inch lens. He didn't know anything about the camera whatsoever. Buster Keaton could take the camera apart and put it back together again. That's the difference.
Okay, so before we go on, to those we're going to form a queue in the chat function at the bottom. Just throw your name into the pile. Ron Young, you're up, and you're on mute right now. You're on mute.
Thanks.
There you go.
Jim, thanks very much for giving us a quick recap of Buster Keaton. So how was he different? Can you help us understand how he was different from his peers, his contemporaries in the game?
Well, again, I think that he was more suited to directing films than the others. Chaplin was a good director, I say, of Chaplin. As far as Chaplin was concerned, the center of interest was wherever he was on screen. Harold Lloyd had other directors. Harold Lloyd was a good producer of his films, but not necessarily a good director. He needed a lot of help in order to do what he did. Keaton was different in the sense that he had a firm grasp. Keaton could have directed films in any genre he cared to, and not necessarily with him. In fact, Harold Lloyd in later years confided to a mutual friend of theirs that he wanted Buster to direct him in early talkies, and Buster would never do it. I think Buster was reticent. He was very shy and modest in his own way, and he wouldn't presume to do that. And this is during some of Buster's darkest years. But that's the esteem that he was held in by his peers, is that Harold Lloyd was willing to say, I want Buster to direct me. At the end of his life, he was supposed to direct Danny Kaye on CBS. And he didn't live to do that, but that was all set up and ready to go when he died.
And what was the business model? How did he make money? And what were the size of the budgets in those days?
Well, he was strictly salaried, which is not the case with Harold Lloyd and Chaplin. They owned their stuff, and they pretty much ran their own studios. Buster did not have a good business head. His concern was solely being able to pay the bills and make films. And he thought and dreamed about them. He said one time that it was really a 24-hour-a-day sort of job during his peak, that there was always something going on. He was always writing himself notes. He was, in that respect, the total filmmaker.
Here's a question, and again, throw your for those who in the chat part. Looking back at the stunts.
This is water, incidentally.
Oh, sure it is. You know, it's wow, it's a little earlier on the West Coast. I'm not saying anything.
Oh,
but here's
right.
a question. It goes to the danger of some of the stunts, not only by Keaton himself, but looking at Harold Lloyd and some of the other folks. The extreme danger, and we're talking about houses falling or fronts of houses falling and landing perfectly. Somebody's on. And how are you able to calculate the danger and keep it funny at the same time? Because if a house was going to fall on me, you've got one take to make it happen right. I wouldn't be looking for the laugh. I'd be scared crapless, making sure I'm not, killed by this falling house that's going to fall on top of me.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go on. How is Keaton able to do that?
I don't think he thought about it that much. As far as he was concerned, the gag was the gag. If it involves some danger, the correct way to pull off the gag is not to get killed. If you were to get injured or killed, then the gag didn't work. And Buster was a consummate professional when it came to things like that. I think there was also an element of honor involved in what he did. I can use another example, which is W.C. Fields, about whom I wrote an earlier book. And he started out as a juggler, as we all know. And he considered it a point of honor that he would not kid a trick, a juggling trick, that he could not legitimately do. He intended and strove to master.
Here's the definition of athleticism: the physical qualities that are characteristic.
Sorry, no, I caught it. Go ahead, keep going.
Okay.
Okay, Marcia.
Anyway, what were we talking about? Oh, yeah. Anyway, Fields could not abide people who couldn't do the tricks in that case, or people who kidded things and couldn't do it legitimately. I saw a letter one time he wrote to his brother, and Fields was suggesting he could become a performer also. And he mentioned in the letter a guy who was in vaudeville at that time, and he billed himself as the world's laziest juggler. And his act consisted of coming out on stage with plates and bric-a-brac of various sorts. He would throw them up in the air and they would crash to the stage floor. And that was his act. And Fields had utter contempt for this guy because he couldn't juggle. And I think Buster felt the same way. It was important that he do a gag in one take in a lot of cases, because that's where the laugh is. The timing was pulled off as such. One time he was doing a shot in his first feature, which is called Three Ages, and Wallace Beery is throwing rocks at him. And at one point, Buster takes a club. They're cavemen in this thing. Takes a club, and he uses the club like a baseball bat and bats the stone, the rock back. It's actually kind of a small boulder. It's about like this. Bats it back into Wallace Beery's stomach, which disables him and he can get away. Well, they did something like 85 takes of that to get it right. And they could have easily have done it in multiple shots, but Keaton would not do that. It was important that it be done in one shot, and that the frame of the shot was correct so you could see everything. Another example I can use, of course, also is that Keaton often insisted that he be photographed in full figure. The reason for that is interesting. If you watch his stuff a lot, you'll see that he doesn't necessarily emote with his face, although he would smile and laugh in the Arbuckle comedies. He stopped doing that later. But he tells you more about what he's feeling and thinking with his entire body. And that's why he had to be shot full figure, I should say. Other comedians didn't work that way. A lot of them worked with their faces primarily, and maybe some sort of a distinctive costume like Chaplin. Chaplin was more physical than some of them, I think. But Buster was one that was communicating a lot more with the stance, how he carried himself, the way he used his entire body.
Lisa, you're up. Lisa Englert.
Okay. Jim, I find it fascinating that you say like he knew the inner workings of the camera, and to give him that perspective for directing. Do you find that perspective on the mechanics played over into any of his other work, like his comedic work? Or
well, I'll tell you where that mindset comes into play is when he's breaking down the elements of a gag. There's a documentary film, wonderful documentary film, was made in the 1960s when he was doing a film up in Canada, and they captured an argument he had with the director of the film, who was still alive, incidentally. And the idea was that the gag had something to do with this high trestle, and Keaton was supposed to motor across this trestle, single track situation up in Canada, and proceed to get tangled up in an enormous map, so that in effect he would not see the danger he was in when he was struggling with this map. And so The director's explaining the shot to him, but Keaton's not buying it. And the director says at one point, well, we have this shot of the bridge that we haven't taken yet. And Keaton gets impatient when he says, the bridge is not your gag. The bridge is suspense. And I heard him say that, and I thought, and I was a kid at the time, and I thought, this guy's the Hitchcock of comedy. He can break down these things into their essential elements. And that's an engineer's mind for you. And I think it's interesting that he had that kind of mind. At the same time, he was reared from the age of 3 to be a comedian. You put those two elements together and you get something awfully unique.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's so funny to
Thank
hear the
you.
words comedy and engineering in the same.
Right.
sentence. You think that they would be running away from each other.
Well, later on when he was at MGM in the 40s and he was a utility gag man, they would bring him in to advise on certain things they wanted to do in films. And Keaton would spend his time in his office when he wasn't needed with erector sets. And he would build these elaborate Rube Goldberg style mechanisms to do ridiculous things like crack nuts or light a cigarette. And they were actually exhibited up in San Francisco one time, put on display because of their ingenuity. But that gives you an idea of what his mind worked. The way it
And
was.
with that, we'll go to Sydney Stern. Sydney, you're up. And you're on mute.
Yeah, I just wanted to change the subject a second and say something about Jim, because I reached out to him when I was working on my book about the Mankiewicz. I don't know if you remember this, but there was a quote in his book of one of my subjects, Joe. And I wrote to ask the source, and he was, I don't know what you were working on. It was your Spencer Tracy biography.
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah, but you dug back into all those voluminous notes and copied what I needed and sent it to me. And that's very generous. So I just wanted everybody to know that.
Well, thank you, Sydney. Didn't we do a panel one time somewhere?
I met you at the bio. You were doing a panel, and I think maybe Carrie Beecham was there too.
Carrie
and I
was
came up
probably
and
there,
introduced myself, and I just wrote you after that, but you really didn't know me. It was very.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I thought we had met, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Jeff Joseph, you're up.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about how bad MGM wound up being for Buster Keaton. I mean, MGM was bad for Laurel and Hardy and the Marx Brothers and Abbott and Costello. They were particularly bad with Buster Keaton. I was wondering how he reacted to that and how it changed the course of his career.
Well, it's the way they were constituted from a managerial standpoint. MGM was the worst studio in Hollywood for comedy.
Yeah.
And I think that part of the reason was that it was a producer controlled situation. In other words, the producers had ultimate authority over the all aspects of the creative process. A studio like Paramount was constituted for comedy. They had the Marx Brothers, they had W.C. Fields, they had any number of people, Jack Oakey, et cetera. MGM really didn't have star comedians. They made funny films occasionally. Later on, they made the Marx Brothers films when Thalberg brought them over. But at that point, not really. So, and Mayer was very strong about that. He would take a new producer and, under his wing, so to speak, and he would say, now, remember, this is a producer-driven studio, and you've got to exert your authority. You've got to understand that, reassert that whenever possible. And unfortunately, he did this with Thalberg's new brother-in-law, whose name was Lawrence Weingarten. And Weingarten started out doing Westerns. He was a publicity guy initially. And it could be argued that he had no sense whatsoever of what Buster Keaton's character was like, how he never studied Buster Keaton's successful films to see what made them successful. He was not an analytical guy in that respect at all. So Thalberg, who was in charge of all production at MGM at that time, which meant, 45, 50 feature films a year, brilliant guy from a story sense, but Thalberg was not a comedy mind. He made things like The Barretts of Wimpole Street or Camille. Those were Thalberg films. So it was tough for him to get his arms around what a comedian like Buster Keaton did, A, and B, how he did it. And the way he did it was they would shoot and they would shoot, then they would go out and put the film before a live audience, take notes, go back, do retakes, do new stuff, take it out again, go back, do more retakes, et cetera. They didn't do that really with the dramas to any great extent. And so just by their very nature, feature comedies were more expensive to do than other kinds of very profitable films. I can give you an example. A Keaton comedy like The Cameraman, which was his first film at MGM, it was done pretty much the way he normally did work. And it was one of his great films. The Cameraman cost about $350,000 to make. And it didn't return much of a profit because it was so expensive to make. By the same token, you had a very profitable property in Lon Chaney at that time, who would make these lurid melodramas. They can make a Lon Chaney picture for $150,000, and they would knock out 4 a year, and they would routinely return $750,000 to $1 million a piece. So they were very profitable enterprises. Greta Garbo back in the silent days, same way. You know, they could make a film with her for $170,000. It would return $500,000, $600,000. Buster didn't have that kind of an audience, and his films were more expensive. So the double whammy there, besides sound coming into play, which meant that the films that were made were more expensive to make. But at the same time, you had somebody in charge who was being told, get the cost of his features down at any way you possibly can. Now, Thalberg was the producer, the official producer on the second film, which is called Spite Marriage, which was Buster's last silent feature. But Thalberg had a lot of responsibilities, and he didn't understand comedy very well. So he turned the Buster Keaton comedies over to Larry Weingarten. And that was a marriage made in hell. Weingarten, if he produced a good Buster Keaton film, it was entirely an accident. And so Thalberg, on the second comedy that they made, a talking comedy, which was called Doughboys, he told Weingarten to back off and give Buster space. And Buster turned in a pretty good film, a pretty good talkie that kind of pointed the way forward, even though he was drinking at that time because his marriage was falling apart. There were a lot of complexities that work into the MGM situation, but essentially he was saddled with a producer who didn't understand him, and his life was in a spiral at that point. He was drinking. There were a lot of things wrong there. And then Thalberg, on top of everything, had a heart attack, took him out of the studio for 10 months. And during that time, Louis B. Mayer, who Keaton was convinced had no sense of humor whatsoever, took the opportunity to fire Buster Keaton. And that's how it ended in 1933.
Thanks.
Marcia, you're up. Marcia Rose. You're on mute. There you go.
Hi, I'm so fascinated with this. I was just curious, you know, there's no trick photography at the time. And I was just curious, as an original person, like how his childhood molded him when you said he was starting at age 3.
Mhm.
Confidence to not continue, but to do something original. He was so agile. I was just so curious about how he moved on, and like his childhood. I was just curious how it influenced his ability to do something like this.
Well, the Three Keatons was the family act that he grew into. He was with them as early as the age of 3, but he didn't join them full time until he had turned 5 years of age. And the act evolved slowly, but in a very good way from the standpoint of improving its quality. What they started out with, the mother and the father, Joe Keaton and his wife Myra, was kind of a hybrid act. Myra would come out and sing and play instruments. Joe would do jazzy things on top of a table. And I know this sounds silly, but he would have a table and chairs on top of the table. And he would do very agile things, like, for instance, he would be able to jump up onto the table from the floor. He would move from one chair to the other. He would stack the chairs one on top of another, move around between barrels, you know, that sort of thing. And as odd as it sounds, this was actually a class of act in vaudeville at that time that was known as silence and fun. And what it was is graceful movements, kind of like, I don't want to say Fred Astaire necessarily, but it was an interesting act, and it involved acrobatics that were self-taught to a large extent. It wasn't a great act when it was just the two parents. So when they brought Buster in at the age of 5, they thought, well, what are we going to do with him? And Joe got the idea because Joe started out doing blackface when he was on the medicine show circuit, but he gave that up very early. And he settled into what was described at the time as a rough Irish specialty. And so he wore this outlandish makeup, a bald cap and whiskers and an Irish costume of sorts, or a stereotypical Irish costume back in the days when we were a nation of immigrants. And so he decided, well, let's dress Buster up the same way. So Buster is like a little version of him. And Buster was small for his age even. When he was fully grown as an adult, he was 5'6", but earlier on, he got away with playing a child a lot longer than he could have if he had grown normally. So anyway, the idea was that Joe Keaton would come out, start to do his normal act, and Buster would come out from the wings carrying a broom. And he would be behind Joe so Joe wouldn't see him, and he'd sweep the broom across the top of the table, knock Joe off his feet and onto the floor. Then he'd turn around, run off very quickly. And so the battle was joined at that point. So the rest of the act was Joe trying to do his admittedly somewhat dull act, and Buster doing whatever he could to disrupt it. Over time, it got more violent, and it developed to where Joe would pick up Buster at some points, and he'd just throw him into the scenery, and or he would throw him like a bowling ball across the stage, that sort of thing. Buster had a specially padded suit that he wore. These were professionally trained acrobatic maneuvers, and so nobody got hurt, although it was one of the roughest appearing acts in vaudeville. But it was a very popular act, and it was very funny, and it became very quickly one of the standard acts in vaudeville. In some cases, it would run upwards of 20 minutes, which was unheard of at that time for anything other than a headliner. So that was what he grew up into, and he was there until he was 16 years of age, and then he went out on his own. But during that time, he could do anything with his body and not injure himself.
Thank you.
Let's see, Shannon, you're up next. She's on mute. What we'll do, we'll come back to Shannon. Pat O'Brien, you're up.
Oh, hi, sorry.
Oh, Shannon, you're back. Go ahead, dear.
Yeah, I just was off camera. Yeah, I was just wondering, it seems they were, that he and Charlie Chaplin were the same era, and I was wondering how he escaped being caught up in the communist witch hunts.
Well, Keaton wasn't caught up in those at all. Chaplin was probably more progressive politically than Keaton was, although Keaton was pretty apolitical. I have a suspicion that he was a little more conservative than Chaplin. He and Chaplin knew and liked each other and respected each other. And that's on display most obviously in a film that Chaplin made in 1952 called Limelight, and about an old music hall act. And at one point toward the end of the film, they want to recreate an 8-minute segment of one of these acts with Chaplin and one of his old time friends. And it was for a benefit performance in London. And so he chose Buster Keaton to come on stage with him to do this. And Buster was delighted to do it. Keaton's agent, who came on a little bit after this, pointed out to Keaton that Chaplin had kind of lowballed him in terms of the fee that he offered him. And Keaton said, I would have done it for free. And Keaton did not need the money at that point. He was doing very well in television, which of course Chaplin would never lower himself to do. But he had great affection for Chaplin and great respect for Chaplin.
So he was basically never a target.
No.
Yeah.
Walk us through his Buster's financial fortunes as he move from youth to middle age to the later years in his life. Because it seemed at one point I saw the picture of the mansion he had
Mhm.
at one point, which was pretty palatial. And
Yeah.
then obviously his career ebbed. And then one of the nice stories that I heard when they did the movie on his life that allowed him to buy a place in the valley or something to that effect.
Woodland
Walk
Hills,
us through
yeah,
it.
which he retired to pretty much, or as much as he could retire. They just tore down that house last year, as a matter of fact, but it was a nice ranch style home, and it had enough acreage that he could keep chickens and grow crops and the like. And he really liked it out there. It was well suited to him. He had a swimming pool, and he rigged the swimming pool with a model train set so that he could serve barbecue and the like out there. And they had the train set running into the kitchen, and they would put food on the various cars. And this was one of those large format, whether I don't remember what they call them, but these large format trains. And so you'd have hamburgers, you'd have beer, et cetera. And once it was loaded up, he'd send it out to the picnic tables in the backyard by the pool. And so guests would, they'd slow the train down, and guests would take off their food, whatever they wanted, and then they'd run the train back into the kitchen for another load. And that's the sort of thing he did around the house, for instance. But yeah, his fortunes really were part of the problem, or part of the challenge with telling the Buster Keaton story, is the first half of his life is nothing but success, essentially. He's a success in vaudeville. He moves to films. He's a success in films. And up until 1929, 1930, he's 35 years old in 1930. He was making great money. He was making great films. And it all came tumbling down. As he said one time, there I was on top of a mountain on a toboggan. And so the next few years were miserable in all kinds of ways. His marriage went bad. He lost the independence that he had as an independent filmmaker. He was a salaried employee at MGM, and they had full control of his output. And when he no longer suited him, they cut him loose. His wife sued him for divorce. He lost the house. So you could say very definitely that the period of the 1930s was hitting bottom, as they say in AA, and then building his way back from there. And the thing that really made a big difference to Buster Keaton was his third marriage in 1940. Eleanor Keaton was everything his previous two wives were not, and she remained with him for the rest of her life. She loved him very much, and I think that she made a big difference in the rest of his life. I don't think that he would have lasted to the age of 70 without Eleanor.
And the follow-up that is, well, it kind of goes into a different direction.
Mhm.
You know, when you look at it, when you look at Keaton's classics, they were in the early 20s, they were black and white silent films. And then once the talkies emerged, once that became the par for the course, and once film began to move to a colorized format, a lot of the silent films were lost, or they were not maybe lost, but they were fairly forgotten.
Mhm.
And you know, in Hollywood, Hollywood can be a brutal place. You're this year's flavor, and you can quickly go to the back of the bin and be next year's forgotten person. I mean, and it was accentuated with the fact that there were a lot of people within the silent era who just couldn't make it into the talking era because of their accents, or because of whatever impeded them from making the transition. How is Keaton able to hang in there in a way others couldn't?
Well, by sheer talent as much as anything, I think. He always had something he could sell. And in the 1940s, when he couldn't stand making two-reelers for Columbia anymore, he walked away from that. He was getting $2,500 a film, and he'd do 2 or 3 of those a year. And, whole families were living on less than that back then, although he had a family support. But I think that when he went to MGM, his friend Eddie Mannix at MGM in 1941 said, I need some income. they said, okay, fine. So they put him on as a gag man, $100 a week, $400 a month. And he proceeded to, once they realized that he was there and he was valuable, he proceeded to go in and fix things in films. A lot of times, the big comedian they had under contract in the 40s was Red Skelton. And so Keaton worked on a lot of Red Skelton films. In fact, Red Skelton remade some of Keaton's silent films, like The Cameraman. So he always had something he could contribute. And in several cases, he actually got involved in reshooting a feature that didn't work out well and saving it. So that they actually took something that was a guaranteed flop and turned it into a moneymaker. That especially happened on a film that he did with Red Skelton in 1949 called Southern Yankee, where it didn't preview well at all. They knew they had a terrible film on their hands. They asked Keaton to look at it and see what was wrong with it. He told them what was wrong with it, and he went in and he fixed it. And he was partnered at that time with Ed Sedgwick, who had directed all of his MGM talkies. And so Sedgwick took the director's credit on the revision of Southern Yankee. And it's a very funny film and very successful, even with the cost of the retakes. So he always had something he could sell. And as long as he did, and he had the energy to work, he had the desire to work. So into the 50s and 60s, when Chaplin was not working any longer or was out of the country, Harold Lloyd was retired. He was sitting around counting his money. And there really wasn't anybody left other than Buster Keaton, who had that kind of heritage. He had that kind of experience, and he could provide the kind of quality that they're looking for. And that even goes to someone like Billy Wilder, who used him as one of the waxworks famously in Sunset Boulevard. When you think about that scene, it was very important that they had Buster Keaton, because Buster Keaton by that point was on a lot of television shows. People were reminded what he looked like. Everybody knew who he was. You wouldn't necessarily look at that scene and say, oh, there's H.B. Warner, who's the other male in that bridge group. You just wouldn't know who he was, but you would know who Buster Keaton was.
Before we go to Pat O'Brien, you had mentioned the name of Eddie Mannix.
Yeah.
Eddie Mannix, for those who saw the one Coen Brothers movie, was become fictionalized, I think, by Josh Brolin.
Mhm.
And I'm trying to think who portrayed him in Hollywoodland. But what was the relationship between Eddie Mannix and Keaton? Because in many respects, Mannix, while a producer, was seen as a fixer. He was the guy who would go in and clean the problems created by artists or directors or producers within MGM and make sure the stories would go away. Certainly they make sure that the arrest records would go away, and definitely make sure nothing would show up in the LA Times or the Examiner.
Well, Mannix was actually for many years the studio manager. He handled union problems, that sort of thing as well. When Buster started at MGM, Mannix was a supervisor, in other words, a producer. And Mannix was the official supervisor on The Cameraman, which is why it turned out so well, because he was a hands-off producer. But that's the reason it went way over schedule also, because Mannix was hands-off. But they knew each other from the mid-20s. Metro distributed the Buster Keaton features for a long time, and Eddie Mannix was an executive going back to that period. So they were friendly. And when Buster built the house that he wanted in Beverly Hills, and not the mansion that still exists, the Italian Villa, but he built a nice little 2-story house on Linden Drive in Beverly Hills as a surprise for his wife. Well, he designed it himself, essentially. He a lot of it was his own work in terms of furniture created, that sort of thing. But it was a modest, by Hollywood movie star standards, house. And the wife, of course, hated it. She didn't like the size of it. She said, where are the servants going to stay, et cetera, et cetera. So he was very deflated. And with him on the big reveal that day, because he did it without his wife's knowledge, was Eddie Mannix's wife, Bernice. And so she loved the house. And he said, well, show it to Eddie. If he likes it, then I'll sell it to you. And so Eddie Mannix bought the house that Buster Keaton built and lived there for most of the rest of his life. And so the period of time when the Italian Villa was built, and it's still there, it's been beautifully restored, incidentally, was the period when he was enjoying his success. In fact, he was shooting The General, which by a lot of lights was his greatest feature film, up in Oregon while the house was being built. It almost got torn down on several occasions. It was allowed to deteriorate under the ownership of James Mason and his ex-wife Pamela Mason. And then some spec restorers bought the place and spent a lot of time and money restoring it to its former glory. Mason unfortunately subdivided the property, so the expanse of land that Buster had when he owned the house had been whittled away. And one of the things that happened was that the house lost the swimming pool. The swimming pool was subdivided into another lot, and there was another house built to be used with the pool. Recently, like say in the last 5 years, the widow of the guy that built the house that had the swimming pool died herself. The house became available, and the people who now own the Italian villas paid $15 million to acquire that house so they get the pool back. And so that's probably the most expensive pool in Beverly Hills.
Wow. Pat O'Brien, you're up, then Barry Keating.
Well, thanks. Actually, my question was about the relationship with Red Skelton, but you kind of already addressed that. And in the movie The Cameraman, which I thought was actually a very interesting movie, although you indicated it didn't turn enough revenues given the expenses. I understood that movie was used often by MGM as a model of how comedy should be done. But do you have any? Is that true, or do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know. I think it was available for a long time for people to run if they wanted to watch it in the studio. I know that when they were preparing Singing in the Rain, they ran a lot of silent films, and that was one of them. I know that the Comden and Green watched that film because Adolph Green told that to a mutual friend that they had examined The Cameraman. And so it was available. I don't know if everybody had to sit down and were forced to watch it. I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but I think it was always regarded as a very, very good film. And I think Thalberg thought it was hilarious. He liked the film a great deal. But I think it was a film that was always respected and known about. And so I have no doubt that a lot of people ran it over the years. I'll tell you one thing that's interesting about Red Skelton. I saw a transcript of a taped interview that Red Skelton did with a friend of his, the author Gene Fowler. And it may have been that Red Skelton was contemplating letting Fowler write a biography of him, because that's what Fowler did in those days. And this was a very, very unvarnished interview. I mean, very frank, extremely frank. And Skelton would talk about how, for instance, if certain performers got out of hand, that the studio would hire a prostitute and send her over to them and calm them down a bit, I guess. The line that Skelton uses, buy them a good time. And anyway, Skelton confided to Gene Fowler he never thought Buster Keaton was funny. But Buster was one of the architects of his success in the 1940s at MGM.
Barry Keating, you're up.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you I thought I knew a lot about Buster Keaton. I'm a huge fan, and I'm finding out all kinds of things I had no idea. I wanted to ask you specifically how you found out about the Vaudeville Act, because I've heard about it for so many years, and they just say, oh, it was tough and rough and tumble, but you described it exactly what it was, and also its evolution. Could you tell me a bit about that, and also just your research in general?
Well, fortunately, there are some eyewitness accounts of the act at various points in its development. And one of the great resources I used was the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which was the organization that was giving the Keatons such trouble back at the turn of the century. And they still exist, and they have a complete archive. So you can go back and, as I did, I handled the actual letters that Joe Keaton wrote to them. And I also looked at the reports that their various officers submitted that described the act, because they were in the audiences auditing the act and seeing what the kids were made to do. Because as Buster once explained, they had a law in the books in the state of New York where you could not, any kid under 16 could not be used in a lot of very specifically specified performance ways. Like, for instance, they could not sing, they could not dance, they were not supposed to emote in a dramatic scene, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They couldn't juggle. This was all laid out explicitly. But Joe Keaton saw an out there. He saw a loophole, so to speak. It didn't say anywhere you couldn't throw the kid into the scenery. And Joe took it so far, for instance, he had a luggage handle sewn into the back of Buster's costume, so he could just pick him up by the handle and throw him. So that's what he used back then. He would say, "Show me where it says I can't do that." And so, but then they said, well, that makes him a skilled acrobat. And Joe would say, "No skill involved whatsoever. Watch this," you know. And of course it was skilled. Of course it was skilled, but Joe was able to finesse that many times, and he got arrested a couple of times. But it was for putting kids on stage necessarily, not necessarily because he was apparently abusing them in some ways. But I do not believe that Buster Keaton was an abused child. Buster always denied it. Logic tells you that. Well, here's the thing that was acknowledged very early on was Buster was the star of the act. And they were told multiple times by various managers that they would never book the act if Buster wasn't part of it, because it was a lousy act otherwise. So there was never any intent to hurt Buster or injure him in any way, because if Buster didn't work, the act didn't work. It was that simple. Buster maintained that he and his father were the best of friends right up to the end of his life, and he never wavered from that. And his father was in a lot of his films, a lot of his feature films. You can see Joe Keaton. He was in short films with Buster. Joe was all around the studio when he was at MGM, et cetera. And Joe came to dinner every Sunday at the house, right up to the time, pretty much close to when he died in 1946. So they had a warm relationship. They had a rupture during the time when Joe was drinking a lot. And that's when Buster broke up the act. But as he said on the Today Show in 1963, we were the best of friends. And he meant it. He was serious.
Here's a question. One of the things you had talked about in the book, one that I read about, that people like Mel Brooks went back and essentially said, without Buster Keaton, there would have been no Mel Brooks movies. Walk us through who else, I mean, who Buster Keaton was able to influence. And in the case of Brooks, Brooks was able to be there while he was still alive. I think, yeah. So walk us through how the influences has continued.
I know one of the regrets of Peter Bogdanovich was that he didn't take the opportunity to tell Buster Keaton how much he appreciated his work when he had the chance, because Buster was working on the Beach Party films when Peter was at American International. There were people who did get to express their admiration, and especially toward the end of his life when his films were being seen again. One of the things that surprised me about Keaton and his life was that for a long period going up until the latter 60s, people couldn't see most of his films. Today, you can stream them on YouTube, you can go out and buy DVDs and Blu-rays of them. Back then you couldn't. You had to go to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, or you had to go to a museum that had borrowing privileges. They were just very tough to see. So Keaton was kind of a legend, but a legend for which there was not a lot of evidence. And when those films started to be seen again is when Keaton really, I think, got his due, so to speak, especially the last year of his life when he went to, say, for instance, the Venice Film Festival. 2 seasons earlier, they had done a complete Keaton retrospective. And so a lot of the audience, when he showed up one night on the mezzanine level, he was guest of honor, And people started to applaud, and he sat down and right at the lip of the mezzanine, and he could hear the applause, and he said to his wife, "Who are they applauding for?" And she said, "You." And by this point, people were on their feet. They were standing on seats, and the applause went on and on and on. And there was a point where he stood up and just looked around. He was in amazement. He couldn't understand it. And someone snapped a picture of him just looking bewildered. What are they applauding for? And I've got that shot in my book. But I think that everybody who's had the chance since that time to sample the Keaton works cannot help but be influenced as they work in the field of comedy. I haven't met anybody who doesn't admire and see Buster Keaton as a strong influence. And Mel Brooks, who did a lot with physical comedy, would certainly understand that. Peter Bogdanovich, I think, was a brilliant guy when it came to staging and coordinating physical comedy, and was able to study Keaton's work as well as his Notebook show. And I think that's true. Quentin Tarantino is another one that reveres Keaton. Skelton was certainly influenced by Keaton, although he would probably deny it. He pretended at one time that he didn't realize that Keaton was working on his feature films. I don't believe that. It's hard to think of somebody who wouldn't have been influenced by Buster Keaton because of the sheer mastery of his body and the body of his work as well.
Ron Young, you're up.
Jim, why did Buster's fortunes fail in the second half of his career?
Well, he was overextended in a lot of ways. He was trying to keep his wife happy, who was kind of in a prestige race with her two sisters, who were both movie stars. And so she needed progressively larger houses. And so he was living beyond his means. He was a salaried employee at MGM getting $3,000 a week. Very good money during the Depression, of course. I'm not denying that, but everything that came in went out again. He was a cash flow wonder. And so he wasn't putting any of it away. He wasn't investing successfully. He owned some property, but that's about it. So when he lost the income from MGM, he went broke very quickly. And then he had to essentially dig himself out of that hole. And it took a long time to do it.
Thanks.
Here's a quick question. You know, there are certain actors who are, they manage their persona.
Mhm.
And for those of us like Lisa and myself who grew up in Rochester, New York, Louise Brooks was always not too far away from the Eastman House. And we would see her on occasion and we were shocked that this was, oh my God, this is a silent era heroine. But walk us through how Buster kept his, or at least worked to keep his popularity going. I mean, this stuff doesn't happen naturally. Yes, you have talent, but it also takes efforting on the part of somebody to keep him in the public eye. How much of that was him? How much of that was his third wife too?
Well, she created a place for him that was safe. I don't necessarily think he would have seen it exactly that way, but she made it possible for him to function in a very real sense. She took away his reasons for drinking as much as he used to. I mean, he had plenty of reason to drink in the early 30s, and he ended up in a straitjacket as a result. But later on, there were times when he would fall off the wagon, but he was a binge drinker, so he would usually have a reason, a trigger for that to occur. But I think that he had that great face, and he always looked like Buster Keaton. That was a big deal. And television came along at just the right time so that he could be seen again by massive audiences, doing what he did best. He would go on the Ed Sullivan Show, for instance, and do a 6 or 7 minute pantomime, bring the house down in effect. And Sullivan was a Broadway columnist in the years when Keaton was on stage and on screen and fully respected what he did. And it's interesting, if you watch the original Sullivan appearance in 1950, and you could tell how much respect Ed Sullivan had for him. And that's available for viewing at the Paley Center for Media. And he says to his audience, this is Toast of the Town, which is the name of the show at the time. He said, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but the next man I'm going to introduce is a great comedian, one of the greatest comedians who ever lived. And you youngsters won't know who he was, but you older folks will definitely know who he was, and you will be delighted to be seeing him again. And he said, I want you to give him the biggest round of applause you've ever given anybody in your life for Mr. Buster Keaton. And he brings Buster Keaton out. That's an unusual, very unusual introduction for Ed Sullivan to do, but that's the breadth and width of his respect for Buster, and it was shared by a lot of people. And so television made him very visible again, and because television made him very visible, he started appearing in films again. And so you see him in Around the World in 80 Days, and you see him in It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, and you see him in the Beach Party Pictures. He was a figure that, or in a face, I should say, that even kids knew. And so a lot of it was luck and timing, and the fact that Buster remained healthy enough to continue to work right up until the day he died, practically.
Okay, who's up next? Ron, you're up, and I'll ask a question.
Jim, how long did it take to make movies in those days? A regular full-length movie? How long were they, and how long was their production cycle?
Well, there's a difference between the independent films, which took a while. He could knock off a two-reeler in about 4 weeks, roughly. When he got into features, I think The General took 6 weeks to make. No, wait a minute, pardon me, I'll take that back, 9 weeks. Some of them took less time than that. He wasn't really worried about his schedule. Film was cheap back then. He said all of our people were on salary, so they were available whenever you needed them. We owned our own cameras, etc. At MGM, typically the schedules for his talkies were 30, 35 days. I think the cameraman initially was 30 days, and they kept revising the schedule because they kept going back and reshooting things. I think the cameraman ended up being 62 days. The exact figure is in the book, but I think it's around 62 days. So the comedies took longer, as I mentioned, than the dramas for the most part. But they took anywhere from, well, then when they lowered the boom a bit, he did Spite Marriage, that did take 30 days. So it depended, it really depended, but generally speaking, a month to 6 weeks.
What was he like to work for? What was his relationship with colleagues like?
Very, very good. I mean, they would take time off for lunch, pull the window shades down and open some beers, have lunch together, go back to work afterwards. Someone who was a writer with him said, Buster was a great guy to work with, not for. You didn't work for Buster, you worked with Buster. And the crew was dedicated to him.
Walk us through the Beach movies toward the end of his life. I mean, how much of that was William Asher saying, I want Buster to be in the movies? And walk us through the relationship with Samuel Arkoff, who was one of the prototypical, almost cliched style Hollywood mogul types, complete with the cigar in his mouth. Yeah,
I don't know that he ever met Arkoff. Possibly. I know that Asher was the one that wanted him in the initial film. No, wait a second. I take that back. The initial film was Pajama Party, and that was not directed by Asher. That was directed by Don Weiss. Asher did the next one after that. It was a writer named Deke Hayward, who came from television, who wrote Pajama Party, which was one of the Beach Party derivatives. And he wrote a part for Buster, and it was he played an Indian in it, in what would today be referred to as cultural appropriation. He was known as Chief Rotten Eagle, I think was his name, and it was just a broad part that had really very little in it that required his great talents, but he liked the idea of the paycheck. He was on for 6 weeks on that film and probably walked away with, $5,000-6,000 for it, and they got his name and his face in it. And his leading lady in those films was a beautiful blonde named Bobby Shaw, and she didn't realize who he was at the time, but she's still with us. And we're doing a Keaton afternoon at the Hollywood Heritage Museum across from Hollywood Bowl on April 10th, and Bobby Shaw is going to join us that day. So if you're in the area and would like to meet Bobby Shaw and talk to her firsthand about the Beach Party films, there she is. She was in a lot of them.
I almost want to expand the question a little bit to include Jeff Joseph as well. To a larger question is Hollywood doing a good job restoring and saving some of those older films? Not just with Keaton, but with Keaton's generation. And I'll defer to Jeff because Jeff's done a tremendous job with the preservation of Laurel and Hardy. And I've had a chance to go see the re-premieres of those. And I'll open that one up to, Carrie if she's still with us. You get an idea if I'm sorry, she had to drop off.
Yeah.
But thoughts?
I think each of these had their own little horror stories. I mean, Laurel and Hardy were Hal Roach. Hal Roach was an operator. He sold rights over and over again. The stuff got scattered to the winds. Nobody really took care of it. Keaton is kind of different. I mean, I think, Jim, you can probably tell the Raymond Rohauer story much better than I can tell.
Oh, God, that gets awfully complicated, Jeff. We don't want to get down in the weeds too much, but
why not? Let's go for it.
Well, Rohauer, as it turned out, was a guy who lusted for his name being out there. And one of the ways that he wanted to do this was to control a lot of valuable films, and he would put his name on them. Raymond Rohauer Presents. And he was running a repertory theater here in Los Angeles, the Coronet, which is still there. As a matter of fact, on what is it? It's on
La Cienega or
La Cienega, that's it. I'm sorry, it went out of my mind all of a sudden. Anyway, one night in the late 1950s, Buster said to his wife Eleanor, I hear they're running The General at the Coronet Theater, and she had never seen it. And so he took her to see it. And he walked into the lobby, and immediately it became known that Johnny Gray was in the house. And so Raymond Rohauer came down from the projection booth and says, I need to talk to you afterwards. And so they ran the film, and he questioned Keaton afterwards, do you have any of your films, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was the start of it. And over a period of time, Rohauer set up a new version of Buster Keaton Productions Incorporated, which Buster was the president and Eleanor was the secretary, as I remember. And they were going to use that as an entity to pursue copyrights on the silent features. And Rohauer was going to restore them and market them. And the basis for a lot of the first films that Rohauer had was the James Mason purchase of the old Buster Keaton estate, because Buster, when he built the estate, had a vault, a film vault built into the side of a hill to store his films. So he had his personal prints of all the features and some of the short subjects there. And so Mason at one point hired a locksmith to come out and open the thing, and there were all the Buster Keaton reels. And because it was considered abandoned property, he was the legal owner of them. And so rather than give them to Buster, he felt that Buster didn't have any way of preserving them himself. And this is before Rohauer was on the scene. He turned them over to the Motion Picture Academy, and the Academy had them. Then Raymond Rohauer came along, they formed this company, and then Raymond Rohauer went to the Academy and said, I'm representing Buster Keaton, and Buster Keaton would like to see these films again. May we borrow them so he can see them? And they knew that something fishy was up, but they couldn't come up with any legitimate reason to deny Buster Keaton the ability to see these films. And so they reluctantly loaned them to Rohauer, and Rohauer immediately took them to a lab and had them copied. And that became the basis of what he eventually owned, were these prints that Buster Keaton had kept in this vault dating back to the 20s. And over time, there were two basic sets of films. One were the ones that the copyrights had been renewed, and there was still a ghost entity of Buster Keaton Productions Incorporated, the original company from the 1920s, still in existence in New York, and they claimed the copyrights. And then there was another group the copyrights had lapsed on, like the General, for instance, was in the public domain at that point. So Rohauer, A, wanted to gain control of the copyrighted ones, and B, create copyright with the ones that had fallen out of copyright.
Pretend copyrights, yes. That was
Yeah.
Rohauer's specialty, pretend copyrights.
Right, pretend copyrights, and he used phony publication dates, as you know, Jeff, to
Yep,
do that.
yep.
And so I've got the story in the book probably as detailed and accurate as ever been told, because I had the great benefit of being able to see the Academy archive file on the James Mason.
Oh,
Douglas.
great.
And so there was a lot of correspondence between Raymond Rohauer and Margaret Herrick about this, and it was very contentious from time to time. But anyway, over time, Rohauer hit on the idea of recutting the Buster Keaton films and putting new titles on them and musical scores, and then copyrighting those elements as improvements. And so that's what he did. He submitted them. He sent prints, 16mm prints, to the Copyright Office, and then started to go out and sue everybody who had prints or who presumed to show prints of these films. And that included Pauline Kael, who was running a film society in Berkeley at that point, and he went after her too. So it was a long process. Now the Rohauer holdings belong to Cohen Media, and the last of them, Battling Butler, went public domain at the beginning of this year. But they have very good prints because they had the Keaton prints.
Did the negatives ever show up to that stuff, or just those prints?
Apparently, I'm told that the negative to General exists, and I don't know which other ones there are that actually exist. I hear occasionally mention, as I'm sure you do, of camera negatives on some of this stuff, and some of it looks awfully good. The other great restoration entity for the Keaton films is Lobster in France.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
And when we do the, I'm going to New York on Wednesday and introduce a 10-program series at Film Forum, and those are all going to be restored Lobster prints, and they'll run the General and Our Hospitality and Go West and the others. So the two great entities that are restoring and preserving the Buster Keaton heritage at this point are Cohen through ownership and Lobster through dedication.
Yeah, I work with Serge Bromberg on some of the Laurel and Hardy material as well. Absolutely. He's a great guy.
He's a great guy. He is indeed, and very committed to what he does. And I salute him. And I'm looking forward to seeing the quality of the work he does.
Very good.
And the follow-up question to you both would be, is there any lost Buster Keaton stuff that has been found recently? And is there any idea of other stuff that might be out there?
Well, there's a lot of television material. I posted a couple things on YouTube over the last year.
It was
or so.
great. Jeff, talk about it. Talk about the one thing you posted about a week ago, about 2 weeks ago.
I think
Three comedians.
Three comedians, I think.
No.
You mean. That
Yes.
interview from 1962.
On Canadian Broadcasting.
From Canadian Broadcasting. I posted that. I've also got access to some of the Buster Keaton television shows from the 1950s that were done locally, I believe at KTLA. And they're being scanned now, and I'll get those up on YouTube in the next month or two, I hope.
How many of those do you have?
I want to say 3 or 4, but honestly, I sent so much material, I can't swear to that. But there was a batch of those. There's also a feature that was done in England based on the Buster Keaton television shows.
Well, now now you're talking about live shows?
Yeah, the live shows.
So those
The
are
kinescopes.
kinescopes, yeah.
Yes, correct.
Now, I ran across a guy who was a collector a couple of years ago. He introduced himself, and he claimed that he had one of the live Buster Keaton show kinescopes, and the guest star is Dorothy Sebastian. Is that one of yours?
I truly don't know. I shipped them off to be scanned without really going through them, so I can't tell you. When I get them back, I'll let you know.
Yeah, Buster had a 10-year relationship with the actress Dorothy Sebastian, and they appeared together in Spite Marriage and did this classic routine where she's dead drunk and he's trying to put her to bed in a nice way. And it's an act that he was able to perform with Eleanor and others up till the end of his life, practically.
There was an appearance, I think, on Circus World, a circus show that
Oh
he
yeah,
did.
that's been on YouTube.
Yeah,
Circus-
I got a kinescope of that, which is being scanned.
Yeah.
There's the three comedians one. There's about 5 or 6 other pieces that I'll be getting up on YouTube during the year, I think.
The thing you learn about three comedians, because I saw it years ago. Was it Paley? I think Paley has it.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, and they have the Today Show as well. But the interesting thing about three comedians is that you get to see a glimpse of Buster's passion for what he did and how seriously he took it. And one of the reasons for that is he's beyond among peers. He's talking with the show's host. He's also talking with Burt Lahr, and he's talking with Eddie Foy Jr. And Burt Lahr, and the chemistry goes back and forth between Burt Lahr and Buster Keaton is really quite interesting in the fact that they're clearly great respect toward Buster and what he achieved and what he was able to do. And Burt Lahr is apparently a lot more talkative than he usually was. I sent it over to Connie Booth, who did a couple of stage productions with Burt Lahr years before she married his son. And she said he talks more on this than I ever heard him speak in real life. So, but that's, I think Buster brought him out in effect. So it's interesting for Burt Lahr as well as for Buster Keaton, but that's a fascinating piece of film.
You're muted, Bob.
Sorry. Now I'm called on myself. No, that's the same Connie Booth who would be in
Faulty Towers.
Yeah, Faulty Towers, and I think was with John Cleese at one point for a while.
She was married to him.
Before we go, we got time for one more question. Who wants to answer? Who wants to ask her? I'll jump in. Frederick, you have an ask. You're up. And then Ron. Frederick, then Ron.
So, Jim, if you had to go to a desert island and you could only have 3 Buster Keaton films, what are your absolute personal favorites?
I've been running them. We just did a couple of shows at American Cinematheque, and I'm going to be introducing the same films in New York. The 3 I'm introducing, I think, would be I'll take that back. I'm introducing Go West, which I feel very strongly about, and people haven't seen that to the extent they've seen some of the others. And so I'm very happy to be showing that to people. Our Hospitality, which I think is a wonderful film and an amazing feature debut for Buster Keaton. And I maintain it's a feature debut. He did a previous feature, but Buster very deliberately shot it essentially as 3 two-reel short subjects that he put together. Our Hospitality is a remarkable leap in technique forward from 3 ages. The third one I think I would pick would be 7 Chances. And that was the first Keaton feature I ever saw with a live audience and live music. And it just blew me away.
Ron Young, you're up.
So did Buster have an international following beyond America? Where else was he popular?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, for a long time, his revenues from the rest of the world were about the same as from the US. There were places in Europe where he was just as popular as Chaplin. And I think that remained the case even into his talkie years. But no, he was extremely popular. And when he needed work and went back to work in a big way in the late 40s, he went to France and appeared for the Cirque Madrano several times and was a big success over there. He did television in England. He did television in, he did live appearances in Germany. He told a story one time, this is in fact on the kinescope from the Today Show, where he was asked to do a TV appearance in Germany, in Berlin, and he didn't have his pork pie hat with him. So he said, okay, I'm going to have to make one before I can go on the air. And so he went across the street to a hat shop, picked out a hat that would work, checked on the price of it. It was a rather expensive hat. He paid for it. He just held out the money in his hand like Americans do a lot of times, and they just took what they needed. And then he asked for a pair of scissors. And they were kind of flabbergasted he wanted a pair of scissors, but they gave it to him. And so he immediately tore out the lining inside the hat. Then he trimmed around the brim, cut it down. They're watching this in horror because they couldn't imagine someone buying a brand new nice hat like that and then doing this to it. And finally, it's done the way it needs to be. And he puts it on his head and they all go, "Oh, Booster." They didn't recognize him until he put on the hat. So yeah, no, he did have a following around the world. He had names everywhere that they called him by, especially in Europe. He was extremely popular and still is.
Great story.
And this is great. And we're going to wrap things up very quickly. The nice thing about the Luncheon Society is we can take something like the entertainment industry and slice it into a variety of pies. Within the entertainment industry, we had, let's see, Roger Ebert on critique. We had Larry Terman on the 50th anniversary of The Graduate, and he told all sorts of Samuel Arkoff stories that could have taken up 2 hours. And we had Lawrence. Well, I'm blanking right here.
I do that a lot.
We've done about 7 or 8 different gatherings, and it's great because it really allows everybody to Lawrence Kasdan. That's what I was thinking about.
We did Dick Cavett.
We did have Cavett, and that was fun. And Cavett would come now and then, and that was, and he's always fun.
Mm-hmm.
And
Zweibel.
Huh?
Zweibel.
Zweibel's fun, and we just had him for he just joined us for Joyce Carol Oates 2 weeks ago, and I'm getting the books out as soon as we're done here. But here's what's coming up. We've got a kind of a semi-private soccer luncheon. If you are into the beautiful game, let me know. But the next 2 big ones are Dean Ornish on his classic book on nutrition, and the Academy Awards one, which will be after that, which will be with Leonard Maltin. And we will fight. We will throw furniture, throw plates as we argue over who should earn the statue. But more importantly, I'm curious why the Academy has given the short shrift to some of the, I'd like to say, accessible awards, and that's maybe a story for another day. But I want to thank everybody for coming, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
All right, take care now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Great
you,
one, Jim.
Very good.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank
Bob.
you.
Keep going, man.
Yay! Well, this was fun. Did everybody enjoy it?
Yes.
Absolutely fabulous.
It was
Glad I
fun. It
could
was-
join in.
There are 2 of you, Marcia.
Bob, I'm so sorry. It ran out of electricity and I had to anyway.
That's
Quick
fine.
question. I ordered one book. I wanted to order another. So do I just send you an email?
Yeah, just send me, because I think the one here is for, this is your writing here. For
Okay. And then
Patrick.
another one is for Tony Dow.
For whom?
Tony Dow, DOW, for him to address it to him.
I was gonna say, it was, what's his name from Leave It to Beaver? No.
Yeah. So he would love this. I'm so sorry I didn't tell him he would have loved today. His
So
mother
wait a minute,
was.
back up. This is Tony Dow, the actor?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
wait.
Oh, yeah, Leave It to Beaver. Tony
Oh,
Dow.
shit. Marcia,
only
you let us
one.
down. Bring him along to the Academy Award one. That would be fun.
Okay,
I used
so
to
but-
work
his
with
mother
the grand, go ahead.
Real quick, so his mother was a silent movie actress who was a stunt double, Muriel Dow. She was a double for Claire Bow, and she was a stunt double. So I was listening to, I just forgot his name, the author. I'm so sorry. who
James
was speaking.
Curtis.
Yeah, Curtis is speaking about, because I was curious about the childhood, about when you don't have trick photography, you just have to do things. Like his mother would jump off of trains onto horses, because that's what you did. I know. And Tony's incredibly athletic, and his mother and father were very athletic, and they're just, so you have to have, I was just so curious about, that growing up piece and where he got that. And I guess being thrown around like a bowling ball, and surviving, just was fascinating.
Well,
So, yes,
yeah, bring him along. I mean, I think the Academy Award one will be fun. It's
Okay. I have no memory. What date did you say it's going to be?
it's 17th or the 18th. I'm not so sure myself. I've been
Which
putting
month?
together.
This month?
this month, because the Academy Awards themselves are on the 28th. Is that correct? The Sunday?
Yes, March
And
28th.
so now there's a great story. I'm not one who
Wait, the
toots my
17th
horn,
and
and perhaps I
18th.
should.
Okay, go
March
ahead.
28th.
Yeah, the Hollywood, the Oscars version of Vanity Fair should be out in a few days. It's a special insert. And Carrie actually did some of the writing, and we all played a small role in helping Haley Mills get her Academy Award replaced.
Nice.
I played it, we had her here, and she was talking about the fact that her Academy Award, which was a juvenile award, was it was stolen from her house in the mid 80s when she was appearing on television here in the States. She came back and was stolen. Now, I knew what happens to replacements Academy Awards. There's a guy named Jeremy Larner who won an Academy Award for a movie called The Candidate. And those of us of a certain age recall it. Robert Redford was Bill McKay, and I've got and Tony's got to be laughing because it's his world. But I was playing around with it as anybody does. You kind of do an Oscar speech, and it slipped. I caught it, and for a moment, I was in abject horror that I had just ruined this man's greatest award. He says, no. What happens is if you break it, the Academy Award replacement. In fact, it happened already once. Now, another friend of ours, Jeff Schneider, who is the son of what's the hell's his name? Carrie would know, and so would a few others. But he won the Academy Award for a movie called Hearts and Minds, which was very controversial when it came out. Schneider, I can't remember his first name, but he lost it in a garage fire. And I went back to Sid Ganis, who's a friend of ours. He was president of the Academy, and he said, "Sid, can you help?" But the story was he couldn't because his father had already passed away. Bert Schneider was his name.
Bert Schneider.
And so what happened here is that I knew what the rules were, but the difference was it was in a Juvenile Academy Award, and they don't make anymore. But Margaret O'Brien had her Academy Award stolen. She wanted to meet me in St. Louis. And what happened there was it was stolen by an angry maid or angry house cleaner or something. Like the Academy Award put it together, and then it was later found at a flea market in Pasadena in the late 90s. So per the arrangement, she had to sign off on a bunch of papers. The replacement Academy went back to the Academy. I thought, well, this is a perhaps option. But at the end of the day, a lot of other interesting people, better than me, they were able to help make the case that she should get an Academy Award. She got a big girl Academy Award, as you saw it. I actually had tea with her. I was in Los Angeles the day after she got it, and she was on cloud nine. So yay. The luncheon.
Bob, I want to mention something about the Candidate. A lot of people don't know this, but Mike Barnicle, the columnist,
he's in it.
He's in the movie. Mike Barnicle is in the movie The Candidate from 1972.
He's got a speaking role. He plays a staffer. He plays a staffer.
And years ago, so I was at NBC, and he was there for Morning Joe, and I saw him in the hallway. And for years, I always planned to bring up The Candidate. So I walked up to him and I introduced myself. I said, "Vincent Capria, nice to meet you. So what are you doing here?" And so blah, 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 blah. I'm here talking to so-and-so that's on Morning Joe, the economist, Stephen Ratner. I was friends with him. So then I said to Mike, I said, "Oh, it's a pleasure meeting you. I always wondered why you weren't in another film. You were the guy in the Candidate." He couldn't stop laughing. He said I was the only person that ever walked up to him and made that joke about him being in the movie.
And Tony could probably, there's a certain segment of a person who knows that movie inside and out. And those people are involved quickly. And And what was fascinating is this was in college, maybe in the mid 80s, we had a question of who would win, Crocker Jarman or Bill McKay?
What a great name, Crocker Jarman. I know.
And I have, because I collect political memorabilia, I have a Bill McKay poster and a Bill McKay button.
Oh,
And we actually had Larmer do a luncheon society with us. This was in 2012. And he said, no, it was not based on Jerry Brown, because at the time when it was written in 1970, Brown was just a newly minted Secretary of State. He said it's just one of those
coincidences
that happens in Hollywood. But the story was, though, and I got to go in a second, I got to get into a conference call, is that he was working on a treatment for a sequel. Now, Redford, I think, is retired, and Redford was reticent against doing all sequels. I don't think, because he wasn't in the Sting 2 and some of the other stuff. But that would have been a very interesting movie. They would have here, middle-aged Bill McKay, and
no, it would have been. I think so. I know you got to run, but talking about movies, I'm a big Godfather devotee. They're running The Godfather on big screen. Yeah. One of my good friends from Hollywood told me they just went to see it in New Jersey on an AMC theater on a big screen. They're doing a 50th anniversary.
Good.
Well, we've been trying to get Francis Coppola, a friend of ours. Tom Luddy was his kind of, Ron, you know Tom, right?
Yes.
He's a wonderful guy, and he comes from time. We haven't seen him in many, many years, but he was in the
Pacific Film Archive.
That's it. He was in Zoetrope,
right?
And we tried, but we couldn't get caught. And he's busy. He's busy. He's got this new movie he's working on. It's But the thing I wanted to talk to Coppola was about his ability to go back and fix a movie. And I'll just stay for a minute. The remake, the reshooting of Godfather 3, which moved it to a much better film, and The Cotton Club. Oh my God.
Also, when he was shooting the one in the South Pacific, all of a sudden I can't think.
Apocalypse Now.
The war movie.
Apocalypse Now.
Apocalypse Now, right.
At the premiere before the premiere, at the screenings, he did a couple of screenings at the Gary Theater in San Francisco, and all the staff was so irate at the fact that he'd been recutting for like a year and a half. Believe it or not, there were people wearing T-shirts that said "Apocalypse When" and "Apocalypse Yesterday" and "Apocalypse Soon." It was hilarious.
And I think it is.
They were mutinying over the fact that Coppola just couldn't decide how to do the couple pieces, and he was doing these screenings, and then afterwards we filled out these questionnaires about what people thought about this scene or that scene. As you know, he did a lot.
They did a documentary.
Yes,
on the Apocalypse. His wife, making of Apocalypse.
His wife did it, Eleanor. And that's a story in itself, because you had.
I know the documentary is unbelievable.
Right.
Harvey.
Brando was kind of on his own, deciding he didn't want to shoot today because he had the hiccups or whatever. It was like he had a real night, and he was on the clock all the time. And Coppola was worried about the money.
And the funny thing is that there was kind of a Heaven's Gate quality about it, because people thought, oh my God, we're spending $15 million or something like that. Which is now basically not the chicken feed, but the film stands, and the redo, or whatever you want to, however, REDUX, redo or whatever it's called.
4-hour deal, yeah.
It's amazing film. I mean, there's another, but Godfather 3 actually was a lot better with the recut. You got
Robert Duvall's great line on the beach. I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, but then he has a follow-up line that a lot of people don't realize. He turns to the soldier and says, "And someday this war is gonna end."
Yeah.
Meaning he's gonna miss it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, like what am I gonna do now?
All right, guys, I gotta go. I gotta prep for a call.
This was like being in person. It was wonderful.
It
Thanks.
was, I
Oh,
think.
yeah, by the way, say hello to Tony Dow. Tell him, do you know that I have watched all 233 episodes of Leave It to Beaver?
Bring him on. We'd love to have him.
Okay.
Thanks,
All right,
buddy.
take care, guys.
Thanks.
All right.
Yeah. Bye now. Bye now.